Okay, so when you hear the name Hammurabi, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For most of us, it's an eye for an eye, right? This symbol of brutal, ancient justice, all carved into stone. But what if I told you that whole image we have is basically a myth? What if one of the oldest legal codes in human history wasn't really about morality at all? Right. Let's just dive straight into that, because this one idea completely flips the script on what we think we know about the dawn of civilization. The whole argument we're digging into here is that Hammurabi's famous code wasn't written to make people good, it was written to solve a problem we are still struggling with today. When the financial rules break down, society itself starts to collapse into violence. So first things first, we're going to dismantle this popular eye for an eye myth. The idea that this was some grand moral document is almost completely wrong. When you actually sit down and read the code, you find out, shockingly, that it's a financial document. It's a rule book designed to regulate an economy that was teetering on the very edge of chaos. I mean, just look at this breakdown. Out of nearly 300 laws, the vast majority have nothing to do with violent crime. Instead, they're about loans, contracts, who's liable for what, and especially debt. This wasn't about punishing sinners. It was about building a financial system that actually worked. To really get why this was so important, you have to picture ancient Babylon for what it really was. It wasn't some quiet philosophical state. It was a bustling, chaotic commercial machine. It was a massive hub for trade in grain, silver, and labor. And that entire engine depended on one very fragile thing: trust. And that's the core problem Hammurabi was facing. See, as Babylon's economy got bigger and more complex, that informal person-to-person trust just wasn't enough anymore. You can't run an entire empire on handshakes and good faith. You need rules. You need shared, enforceable rules that everyone has to play by. Because without those rules, the system was dangerously volatile. Every little economic shock threatened to become a total social breakdown. A single bad harvest or a collapsed building wasn't just a tragedy, it could ignite a whole cycle of revenge and violence. This is the chaos Hammurabi was trying to tame. So here's the crucial point, the key to the whole thing. Hammurabi's goal wasn't to make people moral. It was to make the economy predictable. Unpredictability kills commerce, kills investment, kills everything. By clearly defining who is liable for a loss, who pays when things go wrong, he created the stability you absolutely need for trade to flourish. So how did the code actually pull this off? Well, you can think of it as the financial operating system for the entire empire. It introduced these really specific tools, not for justice, but for pure economic management. The first huge problem was debt. Unchecked debt spirals were just destroying the productive base of the empire, the farmers, the builders. So the code came in and capped interest rates and put a time limit on how long someone could be a servant to pay off a debt. And look, this wasn't about compassion. This was systemic risk management. Hammurabi wasn't protecting the poor, he was protecting the empire's tax base and its food supply. Now, the code's logic on liability, it was brutally simple. It did not care about your intentions. It only cared about the outcome. If a builder's house collapsed and killed the owner, the builder was executed. End of story. This brutal clarity forced people to price that risk into their work. It gave them a very, very powerful incentive to build better houses. And this is one of the oldest financial principles on Earth. The code knew that failure is inevitable. Things will go wrong, losses will happen. The key wasn't to prevent failure, but to make sure that loss was clearly assigned to someone. When people know they'll be held responsible for bad outcomes, they take way fewer reckless risks. It's an ancient solution to a modern problem, people taking risks because they know someone else will pay for their mistakes. This very same logic applied to things like wages and prices. By standardizing how much you pay a shipbuilder or a farmer, the code wasn't trying to be fair, it was trying to reduce friction. You see, every single negotiation is a potential conflict. By setting prices, the code lowered these transaction costs and just kept commerce moving smoothly, like a lubricant for the whole economic machine. Okay, now we get to the part that really shatters any leftover illusions about this being a code of justice. The code's infamous inequality, the part where the penalty depends entirely on your social class. That wasn't a bug, it was a core feature of its design. And let's be crystal clear about this. The system was explicitly, intentionally designed to protect the assets and the power of the elites. Why? Because in Hammurabi's world, their stability was the stability of the entire empire. It was all about preserving the hierarchy. This table just lays it all out, and it is stark. That famous eye for an eye punishment, that only applied between social equals.
between two nobles. If a noble injured a commoner, he just paid a fine. If he injured a slave, he just compensated the owner for the damaged property. It was never about the human cost. It was always about the financial loss to the system. To our modern eyes, this seems wildly corrupt. But to Hammurabi, this was just cold, hard arithmetic. The financial collapse of a single wealthy landowner could send shockwaves through the whole economy, affecting tenants, workers, the food supply. But the collapse of a single laborer, well, that would barely even register. So the code protected the assets that had the biggest systemic impact. Simple as that. And this is where this ancient history suddenly becomes uncomfortably familiar, because this 4,000-year-old logic, this idea of prioritizing the stability of the system over fairness to the individual, it is still the fundamental operating principle of our modern financial world. No, seriously, think about it. Why do we have bankruptcy laws? They're not there to reward failure. They're there to contain it and prevent a domino effect. Why do central banks step in during a crisis? Not because they love the banks, but because they know an unmanaged collapse would be catastrophic for the entire system. These are all modern versions of Hammurabi's core idea. You protect the system first, always. You know, the biggest difference between then and now might just be honesty. In Babylon, the rules and the hierarchy were carved in stone for everyone to see. There was no pretense of fairness. Today, the exact same logic is at play, but it's often buried under mountains of complex legal language and wrapped in an illusion of fairness. Power and risk aren't advertised, they're obscured. And that really brings us to the ultimate takeaway here. We get so frustrated when our financial systems seem unfair or even immoral, but maybe we're just looking at them the wrong way. Their primary design goal was never morality, it was survival. And survival always requires sacrifices. So Hammurabi's code leaves us with this timeless and honestly pretty unsettling question. In any system, ancient or modern, someone has to absorb the losses to keep the whole thing from falling apart. So the real question isn't whether the system is fair. The real question is, can we see clearly who's being asked to pay the price?